Hello everyone, welcome to NUPI. My name is Kasper Szulecki. I'm a research professor in the Climate and Energy Research Group here at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. And I would like to welcome you to this event, Green Finance in the Global South. Can it help combat climate change and aid sustainable development? I would just like to say that this event is going to be streamed. It's available on social media and it's going to be available on YouTube. And well, there's a Norwegian saying, there is no bad weather, there is just inappropriate clothing. Well, as it turns out, it's also, there is no bad weather, there's just online streaming. So I would just like to say hello to everyone watching us from the warm comfort of their offices and homes. Well, can green finance help combating climate change and at the same time promote sustainable development? We would like to be able to say yes to both, but of course the realities on the ground are complicated and sometimes not as rosy. Combating climate change requires immense volumes of funding, which has to be unlocked and generated from different sources. We need it for new energy infrastructures, for renewable energies, for energy storage, but also for grids, which is often the kind of underestimated element. We need them for renovations of households and for retrofitting of buildings. We need them for energy efficiency. We need them for clean transportation. We need financing for sustainable agriculture and forestry. But we also need it for adaptation, so not just mitigation. We also have to understand that some parts of climate change are inevitable, and we have to adapt to extreme weather events, to changes in precipitation patterns, in temperatures, and all this requires different solutions. Some of them are going to be nature-based. Reforestation, afforestation, protection of wetlands, mangroves, different forms. Now, much of this funding has to come from the private sector, from the financial sector, from businesses. How do we actually get enough? The question is, how can we unlock enough funding to meet this enormous challenge? And the second question is, how do we make sure that this transition, the green transition, which we have to go through, is going to be fair and just? And of course, this has been a really important question here in Europe, but it's also a fantastically, important question in the global context. The Global South, as you probably very well know, displays, fantastic potential for green investment. Every dollar invested in the Global South can take us much further than if it's invested in the north, both in terms of emissions reductions and socioeconomic development. But although developing countries are eager to see foreign investment, how can we actually make sure that it boosts their economies, increases their socioeconomic welfare, and helps us meet the climate challenge? So we have this kind of triangle to address. And how do we, sorry for the expression, square this triangle? How do we actually make sure that all those goals are achieved and that they're not contradictory? And how can Norway contribute? I mean, asking this question here is of course relevant. So to discuss this today, we are very, very happy, very pleased to have with us Mafalda Duarte, who is CEO of the multi-billion-dollar Climate Investment Funds, which is a multilateral fund for climate action, which since 2008 has actually sought to square that triangle in some 72 low and middle income countries. And Mafalda has experience from her earlier work at the African Development Bank and the World Bank. And it's a great honor to have you here at NUPI. So Mafalda will begin with a keynote, and then we will also have we're very pleased to welcome Per Fredrik Farov, who is the Director for Partnerships and Shared Prosperity at NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. He has previously spent many, many years at the Ministry of the Environment in Norway, heading the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative. And last but not least, we are also very pleased to welcome Dan Banik, who's a frequent guest here at NUPI. Dan is Professor of Political Science at the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. He's the director of the Oslo SDG initiative and also host of the increasingly impactful podcast In Pursuit of Development. So, Mafada, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and online as well. Thank you very much to the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for this invitation. Thank you, Casper. Thank you. Your surname is also complex, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it. Professor Dan Banik, pleasure to be with you as well, and Fred. Are you called by Fred or no? Fred. Farrell. Very good. Pleasure being with you as well. So this, we are having this conversation at a very interesting point in time, as we know. We have come out of COVID-19. We haven't come out yet, as a matter of fact. We are still suffering the consequences of COVID-19. And it's important to realize that it was actually quite a significant pandemic with quite significant consequences. More than 6 million people died globally. We saw massive losses of jobs, more than 220 million jobs lost. And we also saw, for the first time, quite in a number of years, a reversal in terms of poverty reduction. Even in energy access, we saw in sub-Saharan Africa, for the first time since 2013, 13 million people more without, they actually lost energy access. We know that developing countries, this conversation is about the global south. Of course, developed countries suffered from the impact as well, but developing countries suffered quite disproportionately. And we know as well from the IMF and the World Bank that while developed countries will this year recover, go to pre-pandemic levels, developing countries, many of them, most of them will not. It will take a few years to go back to pre-recovery, pre-pandemic levels. And this was before Ukraine. Now with Ukraine, it's going to be even more challenging. We also know from COVID-19 that there was a lot of discussion around learning from the lessons of 2008 and making sure that the stimulus and the fiscal stimulus to tackle the crisis would be targeted to green recovery initiatives and investments. And we haven't necessarily seen that experience trigger to the degree that it was necessary with this pandemic as well. And we have several studies from several organizations showing that, as a matter of fact, quite a low proportion of the fiscal stimulus went to green recovery measures. And we have seen the rebound now quite significantly of GHG emissions, which we also had seen in 2008. So this is COVID. Now we have the war in Ukraine. And this has just aggravated matters significantly, not just because of the energy crisis that we are experiencing globally, but also, and quite importantly, because of the food crisis. We are seeing energy prices increase more than 50%. And the world food commodity prices driven to their highest levels ever. and therefore this triggers to inflation as well. We are at an 11-year high inflation levels. And of course, because of that, the central banks have had to raise interest rates, and that has a significant impact as well in terms of debt and debt burdens in developing countries. So this is what many could call a perfect storm, where we were already challenged in terms of climate and the impacts of climate and the need to make significant investments. Now with the pandemic and with Ukraine, the broader macroeconomic context has just made it quite more challenging. I'm sure that we will have the chance to talk about this, and in developed countries, and in Europe in particular, there's quite a bit of debate right now in terms of the response to these energy price increases and this tension between to respond to the macro and the social implications of this and the demand, because the demand is also has increased quite a lot, and the climate goals and the climate objectives. So this tension now it's a big debate, and it hints very much at short term versus medium term or long term. So a big question is, what are the investments? We see a lot of people talking about making capital investments. If we make certain capital investments, new greenfield capital investments, we are locking in capital for several decades. That is not necessarily aligned with the climate goals. So how does one respond to the immediate crisis without locking in capital that really doesn't align with the climate goals? This is a big question. Many of the investments that are being discussed in the media, they wouldn't even be up and running for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So they wouldn't be a solution even to the immediate crisis that we currently have. But this is a big tension. And then on the other hand, it's all coming together. We are seeing, so there is this tension in developed countries and this debate around the short versus the medium long term. And I think there are nuances here in terms of the debate in Europe and the debate in the US. We can get to that discussion as well. But if we think about developing countries, and it's really important to think about developing countries, or what was called here the Global South, because I think we have to understand that it's in the Global South that our climate challenge will be solved. I always say that it is very important what is done in developed countries, in North America, others in Europe, because it will also have to show leadership and show the way. But actually, if we look at the numbers, the climate problem will be solved in the Global South, in developing countries, because that's where most of the population is. More than 85% of the population live in developing countries. That's where most of the GDP is. More than 50% of global GDP is in the Global South, and that's where that's where most of our electricity, our energy systems, in terms of capacity, are. So this is really. It is really important that we focus in developing countries, in the Global South. And it's a bit worrying, Professor Dan, some colleagues of yours from Stanford actually recently passed this information on to me. What is happening in terms of the energy sector in developing countries? More than half of the new electricity generation financed in emerging economies from 2018 to 2020 is too carbon intensive to align with 1.5 degrees. And one of the reasons for this misalignment is natural gas. Because these natural gas investments that are happening in emerging economies, They are projected to emit as much 80% as much carbon as the fleet of coal-fired power plants that have been financed during the period. And most of these plants are being financed with domestic resources. So there's actually quite a buildup of investments in emerging economies that are not aligned with the 1.5. I mean, we are seeing right now these days in India with the massive heat wave that has impacted the country. They've had to go back, and they are going back massively to coal and coal production and coal use. So this is quite a challenging international environment and political economy for climate at the moment. We'll talk about coal. I'll talk about coal in a little bit in emerging markets. But I want to layer one more thing in this conversation. Besides the pandemic and Ukraine, on top of what was already challenging in terms of climate, I want to layer inequality, because I actually think we have to pay, and my topic was actually quite a lot on just transition, on inequality, because I actually think this is going to be a critical. To me, I always see the climate agenda as two sides of one coin: climate, social justice, and just transition. And I will explain why. We are seeing inequality increase globally. And if you look at some of the statistics, and I guess you see it here in Norway as well. In fact, I was having lunch with some colleagues, and they were just from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were just in one of the countries that is more equal in the world, but you are also seeing inequality increase slightly. But inequality has been increasing globally. And it's some of the statistics are quite staggering. Oxfam has come out and said the world's richest 1% have more than 2 times the wealth of 6.9 billion people. We have more than 1 in 5 young people that are not employed, educated, or trained. ILO says that 3 out of 4 of these young people are women. And we have 20% of the world's children. These are almost 400 million children that live in extreme poverty. Why is this important from a climate? It's important from a social and a human perspective, of course, but why is this important from a climate perspective? I think we've gotten a sense from what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes, from what happened in Chile, what happened in Ecuador, when the governments actually tried to introduce reforms that were aligned with climate goals. But the backlash socially was quite strong and led to the reversal of the reforms and the policies. So this dimension of inequality and social justice really needs to be at the core of everything we do when it comes to climate change. I want to layer here, we're talking about finance. So I'm talking about COVID and the challenges of COVID. I talk about Ukraine, talking about inequality. Developing countries suffered disproportionately from all of these compounding crises: climate, COVID, and the Ukraine now. And how is that also manifested in terms of finance? Some interesting data points as well. In fact, the UN released a report recently, and they are calling it the Great Finance Divide. Developed countries spend 3.5% of their revenues on interest on their debt, while developing countries had to spend 14% of their revenues on debt service. The average interest cost of outstanding government debt is 1% in developed countries, but it's 3% in developing countries. So as we can see, and now we have this issue of high levels of debt distress. These have doubled since 2015. We have a lot more countries, 60% of the least developed countries and other developing nations that are now at high risk or already in debt distress. So we have this dimension as well. This is why I come back to the point of the importance of focusing in developing countries. This is where the climate crisis will be solved. These are the countries that, because of the pandemic, because of Ukraine, because of climate, are less prepared to tackle the challenges. And we have this opportunity right now, which had existed in the pandemic too, and which is to transform radically, because that's what's necessary in terms of climate, is radically transform our economies. It's going to require massive shifts across the board in all sectors, and do it through a justice, a climate justice, a social justice lens. Let me talk a little bit about just transition and give you a little bit of a sense why this is complex and why it does require deliberation. We have ourselves conducted a literature review on everything that has been written on just transitions. And 3/4 of the literature is focused on the United States, Australia, or its global literature. There is very, very limited analysis and literature on other countries and regions as well. So these regions and these countries haven't been studied. They haven't been written about or analyzed. And as we have been doing work in this area, some of the things that we have found to be critically important, we look at this just transition from two lenses. One is the procedural justice, and the other one is the distributive justice. Procedural justice speaks about processes. Are we engaging the communities? Are we engaging all of the stakeholders? Are they being empowered to participate and voice their priorities and be part of the decision-making processes, be part of the implementation? So that is the dimension of procedural justice. Then we have the dimension of the distributive justice, which talks about, do we really understand the distribution of costs and benefits? That's one question. Do we really understand it? And if we do understand it, that's a premise that we need to understand this distributional dimensions. And then what to do about it. A lot will be related to livelihoods. How are we ensuring livelihoods through these transitions? What are the alternative sources of income and livelihoods? But in order for that to happen as well, of course, there needs to be support to economic activity, but there needs to be support to skills development so that people can pick up these new jobs. And we also have to think, inevitably, there will have to be some social protection or social safety nets to tackle transitions and people that will necessarily be impacted through the transition. We've done work on the coal sector, and we have done work on the natural resource management sector when it comes to just transition. And just to give you a sense of how complex this just transitions can become. We all know the coal sector and how important, I hope that we all have a sense of how important it is to accelerate coal transition. It's the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the largest contributor to the global average increase in temperature. It's also responsible for 4 million premature deaths annually. And it's very clear that we will not meet the climate goals if we don't significantly accelerate coal transition. And the challenge is in developing countries, because the average life of the coal-fired power plants in developing countries is much, much lower than in the US and developed countries. So in fact, most of the coal-fired power fleet in developing countries is, the large majority is below 20 years in their life cycle. These are investments that last for 40, 50 plus years. So it is a big challenge. There's a lot of economic life to these assets in developing countries. And when we look at it from this just transition and the social dimension, and we did so. We did studies in Jharkhand in India and in South Africa in Mpumalanga, where most of these coal mines and coal-fired power plants are. In South Africa, it's quite geographically concentrated. In India, is a little bit more widespread. What we have come to realize is we can't just focus on the direct jobs. We can't just focus on the people that are employed in the coal-fired power plants or the coal mines. There's a whole supply chain, and there's an informal economy, a lot of informal workers that are actually quite dependent on the coal industry. So some numbers just to give you a sense. In South Africa, in Mpumalanga, it's 10% of the direct jobs. But when you include indirect jobs, we are talking about 30% of the total jobs in the province. And 50% of businesses that offer services to these industries. So in fact, this economic sector represents or contributes 25% of the region's GDP. These are big numbers. But this, again, is just a couple of other layers beyond the direct jobs. When we looked at India and Jharkhand, we saw even additional layers. So 150,000 coal industry pensioners in that province are being partially paid by the current workers. So this has an impact on pensions as well. Not just current, but future pensions of these workers. In addition, of course, in addition to being a revenue source for the local governments, and in South Africa is the same thing, and in addition to the fact that they provide social services to the communities, there's another dimension that we have written about, analyzed, researched, and written about, which is the railways. The Indian railways are really heavily reliant on these revenues from transporting coal. 40% of their revenues come from transporting coal, and they actually subsidize the fares for the average Indian population, and they actually subsidize it quite extensively. It's almost 60% is subsidized by the Indian railways. So as you can see, we start to pretty quickly see the web of implications when one thinks about decommissioning coal-fired power plants or closing coal mines. Another interesting data point in South Africa is that the average salary, the minimum salary in South Africa is around, according to the data that I saw, it's probably around $400. The coal mine workers actually receive more than the double of that. So these are more higher paid jobs. Of course, they come with other risks, and that's one of the reasons potentially that they have higher salaries. These are highly unionized jobs as well, but it's more than the double, and this we have documented as well. So it's a real challenge when we start to look at all of the web of connections and implications, and all of this really requires understanding how we go about supporting the procedural and the distributive justice. I've probably exhausted my time already. We've also looked at, and you can check it out, we done another case study in Ghana. This is for forestry sector. So another thing that we wanted people to understand is that just transitions is not just a coal sector issue or an energy sector issue. Just transitions, it cuts across all the sectors. So we have also commissioned work on the forestry sector in Ghana, and we have commissioned work on the water sector in Bolivia. That's another study that will come out at some point in time in the near future. So all of this to say that unless if we are deliberate, this is not going to, we are not going to see results in terms of just transition if there isn't deliberation. We can't just think that it will happen as a function of doing certain investments. It will not, because we actually, in most of the countries, there isn't enough understanding of these transitions. What do these transitions actually mean? Who stands to be impacted? Who stands to lose? Who stands to gain? Where are they? There are geographical dimensions as well. And so it's really important to understand that this is not just a matter of focusing on green investments, but it's a matter of being quite deliberate about just transition, about social justice, and actually seizing this opportunity where trillions of dollars of investments are going to be happening in developing countries mostly, because we are talking about $90 trillion of sustainable infrastructure investments according to OECD in a span of a decade. 2/3 of these investments are going to happen in developing countries. And so the question to us is, how do we make sure that we are not locking in all of those investments in high carbon and not resilient investments, and that we make sure that the inequalities that I was talking about, which are increasing globally, and that the transitions that will necessarily have implications, in particular, and they tend to have implications for the most vulnerable. How do we make sure we are tackling them at the same time? I didn't speak much about I didn't speak at all about the climate investment funds. We have been working, our funds are dedicated to climate action in developing countries. As Casper mentioned earlier on, we have been doing this since 2008. We have portfolios of investment in 72 countries across sectors, not just energy. We have investments in the water sector, in agriculture, in forestry, coastal zone management, and have a fairly good understanding of the role that support from developed countries and public capital can play in terms of driving impact and results in terms of mobilizing private sector capital. And we are now, because we are having a better and better understanding about just transitions, we are going to double down our efforts to make sure that the investments we are going to be making in the near future really have that deliberation in terms of just transition outcomes. We've launched last year 2 programs, one on coal transition, accelerating coal transition, another one to support the power systems, energy systems to take on a lot more renewable energy. We are launching in 2 days a nature program and hope to launch later in the year a cities program and an industrial decarbonization. So we are bringing 10 years plus of experience to bear, and I'm happy during the panel to talk a little bit more about private sector capital mobilization. There is a role for public capital in developed countries to play, an important role. It has been demonstrated how it can be done in some ways. There are new ways that we ourselves are exploring, and others on how we maximize this limited public capital to really bring a lot more of the private capital to bear. Because the other thing that we have to understand is that the flows of private capital that are currently going into emerging markets and developing countries are way behind where they need to be if we are going to meet the climate goals. So happy to now engage in the panel discussion and talk about some of the things that I didn't manage to speak about in my intervention. But if there are two thoughts to leave you with are these two or three. We have to focus on developing countries because they are suffering disproportionately from the compounding crisis. And that's where actually the climate is going to be, our climate crisis is going to be solved. Two is that without a real clear focus on just transition and the social justice, I personally don't believe we can meet the climate goals either. So we actually have to seize this opportunity.
First come, first serve. Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Mafalda, for this inspiring keynote. I would like to ask Per-Fredrik and Dan to comment on this a bit, also to answer some questions that might be coming out of this, especially what you said at the end, the role of developed countries and their support for, well, establishing a better investment climate also in developing countries. Per-Fredrik, what are your experiences as a representative of, well, the Norwegian government, so the state funding which can support private investment in a way? I mean, of course, investors are interested in returns on profit. They're interested in risk, which can be hopefully mitigated somehow. And they're also interested in a certain time horizon on which this return is expected. And the time horizon for shareholders is not necessarily the same thing as the time horizon that we have for from a climate perspective, especially with nature-based solutions. And it's also probably not the same time horizon as the developing country governments have. So what can states in the global north do to facilitate this?
Yeah, good questions. I'll sort of answer them in a roundabout way. I mean, the main thing we can do is support ambition in the South. I see Mr. Ambassador from Indonesia is here, and you know the ambitions that were articulated by President Yono in 2009 and then followed up by President Jokowi and his ministry Busiti after that, essentially driven deforestation down by, I don't know the latest numbers, probably. And supporting those kinds of efforts is probably the best thing we could do, and we should commend the Indonesian government for that effort. First, thank you for an excellent intro, and I fear I'm going to be slightly repetitive. I'll try to be brief where I'm repetitive, because I think what's happened in the bank the last 15 years is actually quite noteworthy. I don't think climate change really was on the agenda that much 15 years ago. Of course, the CIFs were established, but very much as a fund, which were doing something that was a little bit outside of the mainstream. And that's changing in fundamental ways in the bank, and that is really important given the bank's role, and I'll come back to that later. I think the key point, right, it runs through all you're saying, is that this issue needs to be fully integrated in national development policies, and that goes way beyond any given fund or any given support program from the north. It's a fundamental issue of system change, and that's really at the heart of this. I would say two elements. One, system change is the essence, and the second is we got to face the fact that the SDGs in general and climate specifically too are massively underfinanced, whatever way we look at it. And we got 8 years to fix that. So let's be quite clear-eyed about the challenge. So on that note, 3 brief points. The first is very repetitive, so I'll be very brief, but it's either both just and green, or it simply won't happen. You'll have a political backlash. So you need to fix that, and agree with all the points made there. I was going to use the coal miners in South Africa example, but you took that away. It's interesting that we have the same example. That underlines your point that little analysis is done. So when we find a good example of analysis being done, we all use it, and it becomes a bit repetitive. But I mean, it's really a just transition perspective needs to permeate everything we do on this. And I think starting to think creatively about how we ensure social justice in these transitions is key. And that means getting granular at the country level and really starting to use instruments like social safety networks, like payments for ecosystem services, which can very much double with equity, for example. So going into that space to create social justice in the transition is key. And this is also a top-level priority for the current Norwegian government. The second point is, dealing with this, we really need to get granular. We have one big challenge, but it's really got different elements that require quite different solutions, and we need to address all of them. So it's partly the politics. What drove deforestation reduction in Indonesia was good policy and enforcement, same thing for a while in Brazil. And we need system change in the fundamental sense of changing the rules of the economy so that the money goes in the green direction. That's what's going to close most of the financing gap. That means tough reforms, and that's very challenging. That brings us back to the social equity point. But reforms we have to do, and that needs to be front and center. Then we need to address risks for businesses, as you pointed out. So, and I think that has to happen along 2 tracks. One is the reform agenda, over time establishing better financing, environmental framework conditions, so to speak, that takes down the perceived risk. But businesses also need to start to learn these markets and take down perceived risks, because I think it's quite clear that markets you don't know look scarier than they really are. Blended finance can drive that part of the challenge, because it will allow business to enter markets, start working, making green investments, learning the environment, and thus increasing their presence and investments over time with gradually less public support. But as an entry point, blended finance is quite crucial. NORAD is working on that. It's a priority of this government too, focusing particularly on, I think, land use and energy, which I think is a huge part of the solution. And then lastly, there is actually a lack of public money, and I think we need to finance that too. I mean, we often reference, these countries should increase their tax base, be better at stopping corruption and so on. Yes, that is true, and everyone has governance challenges. But I think especially for the least developed countries, the residual is just too big to manage with their own finances. It doesn't matter what they do on taxation. There's got to be a greater flow of international support. And that's not a political opinion. I think that's a fact. Third point, all of this, I think all the elements that I mentioned now and most of the elements you talked about is really about sharing risk, because it's the perception of risks that inhibit us from putting the money to work in things that we know will create value. I think there is excellent evidence, and the World Bank has been instrumental in creating that evidence, that this transition, if you just look sort of where should we be in 10 years, it's good for pretty much everything, perhaps except the Norwegian oil and gas industry and those sort of profiting from non-green. But overall, for the globe, it's going to be a good thing. The problem is dealing with the transition. And at the heart of that is dealing with the risks of the transition. And that really has to be done together. So there is sort of an essential large-scale risk-sharing initiative that we need if the kind of money that has to flow is to start flowing. I think guarantees are a key element of that, but it's really at a quite different scale from where we are now. I'm not going to be sort of explicit about solutions to that. I'm just pointing to, again, it's a fact. There isn't the financial capacity in the countries that will have to make most of the investments. I think Malawi point that this is where the potential is. This is where we have to invest to deliver on that potential. And the financial ability to do that is not there without support and risk sharing. And that has to happen. So there is some kind of comprehensive grand bargain, if we're serious about this, that needs to happen. And that will require funding flows internationally and internally, redistribution at a scale probably not seen in peacetime. But it also, of course, will have to be matched by reforms. Because over time, this money needs to flow, quote unquote, naturally to the green sectors. That will require reforms. So there is a quid pro quo here of guarantees, risk sharing, and will to reform politically. I think what has been done in the energy field, the international work on RUDD+, essentially saying that tropical forests are a global public good, but the countries managing that good, who has those forests on their territory, of course, can't be expected to carry that whole burden of protecting those forests on their own. And there are similar issues on the energy transition, for example. It's clear that a perfect future energy system can be green, but the transition there is expensive and it has a different, how to put it, schedule of expenses and returns that makes it really hard to manage if you're a cash-constrained emerging economies or developing country. That need to be dealt with if the change is going to happen at the speed we need to. I'll end quickly with two sort of questions/challenges to the bank, and I think it was actually quite appropriate that we spoke less about the CIF and more about the big picture, because the bank has that potential to play a big picture role, which goes beyond, of course, the CIF is a key instrument, but it goes way beyond that. It's about advisory services, it's about support for policy planning, it's about leadership and convening. So my first question is sort of mainstreaming 2.0. As I mentioned initially, it's been impressive to see how much the bank has changed in terms of internalizing climate issues into its entire activities. But like for everyone else, there's a little bit of a way to go. So where do you see the bank going in terms of making all its activities Paris compliant, so to speak? And the challenge/question number two is, in addition to that, there is a unique position for the bank in helping to drive similar developments more broadly, globally. Someone needs to lead, convene. The bank is one of those that can actually do it. So what do you see? How do you see the bank's role going forward in driving this socially just green transition that you described?
Thank you very much, Frederick. My father, would you like to take the questions now, or would you rather also wait for Dan's?
Wait, it's okay. We can. Maybe he's also going to ask me a couple of questions.
Exactly. So.
Professor Dan.
Right, Dan, you are an expert on, well, among others, poverty and development, and well, the question of social injustices and justice, as well as inequality. So my question to you regarding what Mafalda has been saying is, well, what sort of governance structures or what sort of institutions can we put in place to be able to address this during the transition? So, I mean, financial institutions and investors do not necessarily have those any ethical additional ethical considerations that would be necessary to take those things into to put them in the scope. So what can we do from a political side? That's one question, and if I may, also another one. Now, today we've been discussing developing countries as a whole, so divided from developed countries on economic grounds, but they also differ politically. So is there a difference in the capacity of more democratic regimes versus more authoritarian regimes in dealing with this, especially with this aspect of participation and justice on that level?
Okay, two great questions. Thanks, Casper. I'm delighted to be here, by the way. Let me just reflect briefly on how Mafalda ended, because I think the key point here for me is to actually zoom out and talk about deliberation. Because as I understand it, this might be not typically, I can talk loudly. So, okay, no? Is that working now? Okay, good, good. I usually have a pretty loud voice. So deliberation, I think my point here basically is the ethics of all of this. My understanding parts of the world don't really resonate in whatever is this animal that is the global south. Now, the global south, as we see it, is India and China that are very vocal countries that have a lot to say, that are, of course, politically very different. We can get back to this. But they also have an outsized voice sometimes in much of these debates, at the COPs, at many of these events. What worries me is the kind of voice of the other half, the smaller countries, the Malawis, Mafalda, you've been there, you've worked there, those who don't have that kind of agency. And I think you also refer to something extremely important, and that is in the literature. Most of the evidence is about certain countries. Developed, it could be South Africa, but not the neighboring countries in Southern Africa. So the BRICS get a lot of voice, the others don't. The big countries like Nigeria may have a voice, but not perhaps Rwanda. And I think it's here some of the ethical challenges arise, because there's this feeling that what the global north is doing, and this is one strand of the criticism, that the rich country climate policies is actually colonialism in green. It is something, I think it goes back to this idea of sustainable development that we still have embraced in many ways, is that development that meets our needs but also takes care of the needs of future generations. That is the kind of understanding, I suppose, here in Norway we'd be very comfortable with, because we're thinking about our children, future generations, etc. In Malawi, I just returned from this country that I love. I've been researching there for the last 16 years. People say, we can't think about the future generations because it is now that I need energy, because Malawi has 10% of its 18 million people are connected to the grid, and even that 10% has very, very it's never a regular source of power, lots of power cuts. So there are huge challenges. And I think that is the first set of issues in terms of deliberation, Mafalda, that we really need to address. And that is, on whose terms are we talking about these financing criteria? If you're talking about climate finance, on what terms? And this goes back to Paris, the climate talks, where a lot of the so-called developing countries were basically saying mitigation, emission reduction is one thing, but adaptation and poverty reduction is our goal. And so this is where we are at now, where a lot of voices, and I want to highlight the African voices here, are basically saying that what is happening is not the kind of investments that we want. It is, for example, Norway or others telling the bank not to finance natural gas projects in Africa. Many countries, Mozambique, Tanzania, trillions of tons of natural gas, you mentioned this, that a lot of African leaders would like to use now to address the poverty reduction problem, to address the energy security issue. But that kind of investments is not being facilitated. So I think there's this frustration in Nigeria. I think President Buhari has written about it. In Malawi, President Chakwera has been talking about it. In Uganda, President Museveni is talking about it. Everybody is saying basically that, and more recently, the Vice President of Nigeria put it very succinctly, Osinbajo, that this kind of, the current regime is not allowing us to focus on the kind of priorities we have. That's one set of issues. The second has to do with really the kind of infrastructure needs that a lot of countries in the global south need. And this is where I think there is this lack of appreciation often in the global north that there are certain things that really have to improve. China has been, phenomenal in that sense, has been building infrastructure, often, of course, not the kind of infrastructure that is required, like coal plants, but now, of course, that there's an end to that. But in terms of just, energy is one thing, but just roads, buildings, some of the resilience issues that you talked about, there is that need to see this whole challenge from a holistic, I hate to use that word, perspective. So, but this doesn't mean that all the responsibility is at the international level. It's not just aid or what aid is spent for. It's not just the multilateral banks. It's not just the fact that private finance doesn't want to go into high-risk areas. It doesn't want to go to some of the countries that I want to study, but it goes more to India and China and many others. There are lots of issues that are also important at the national level. And this is where the politics comes in and goes back to your question. And Per Frederick mentioned this too, that there are certain issues that relate to the lack of capacity, another buzzword that we use, that a lot of countries want money, want finance, without really developing a viable plan as to what this money is going to be spent on. And I think this is very crucial. I think if I were, a policymaker in Malawi or in Kenya, wherever, I want to actually show that I have a vision, I have a good plan, and this is where I want to attract financing. And then I can complain that people are not funding me. So I think there's also the onus at the national, local levels to actually design viable plans that can attract that kind of international funding, either from the private sector or from elsewhere. Going back to, finally, your issue about the political sort of the regime, I just recently finished a paper looking at India and China on sustainable development. It turns out both countries have actually embraced the SDGs, at least the political leadership at the highest level. Since 2015, both the leaders of China and India have been talking warmly about SDGs. They're implementing this. There's a lot of focus in budgeting in relation to the SDGs, operationalizing criteria. But Mafalda, you also mentioned some of the challenges, right, in terms of, say, coal. And this is where I think I was in India in November, December of last year, and I was speaking with senior foreign ministry officials, and they were so frustrated. The fact that the global discourse in many ways vilified India and China for this whole phasing down versus phasing out. I think there was this feeling, and I've been, of course, studying China too, that the rich world doesn't really understand some of the challenges of meeting the energy needs, precisely due to some of the reasons you outlined. The coal sector, the Indian railways is really, really important. Coal is important. It's the informal sector, it's employment, but it's also government revenue. A lot of the federal governments in India are reliant on the coal sector. And just the fact that you have, I think, many Mumbais that are going to grow in terms of the urbanization in both India and China that will require energy at such a huge level that any form of just renewable energy is not going to be enough. So in terms of the kind of the political dynamics, I find that there is not much of a difference in terms of a democracy versus a non-democracy. There is this kind of political embrace of certain ideas, but there's also a pushback that India and China can undertake that a lot of the smaller African countries can't. So my final point here, I think, is going forward, say in COP27 in Egypt later this year, it'll be really fascinating to see how this kind of African agency. There's now growing talk about how African countries should actually coordinate their policies better, seek better deals. I think this is going to be very important, not just in relation to their sort of projects from India, China, but also in relation to many of these sort of, I wouldn't say diktats, but aid policies or whatever that a lot of these countries feel are being forced down their throat. So my key point here, and since you asked me to ask you a question, well, because we're supposed to also have a dialogue, is I'd like to hear your views, Mafalda, on how you see this kind of this agency or the lack of it from many of these smaller countries. They feel that they're being, pushed into a corner where poverty reduction has got lesser attention. It's all about climate. It's all about the future. And there's a lot of scaremongering on Africa that doesn't contribute much in terms of global emissions, but there's the scaremongering that, if Africa develops, everything's going to get bad. And that is where the ethics comes in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. I will abuse my role as a moderator to also jump in with a question following up on what Dan was saying. I mean, Mafalda, your native Portugal is, well, in the European context, the champion of coal phase-out, whereas my native Poland is not. Let's put it this way. And of course, speaking from I mean, we're here in Norway. It's very easy to understand to what extent our welfare is built on and based on fossil economies. Here in Norway, if you count the indirect jobs of the fossil sector, it's almost 1/3 of the entire economy. So it might seem that in developing countries who are yet to build up their energy systems and build their economies or develop their economies, they might at first glance seem to be in a better position. And we've seen this in this concept of leapfrogging, right? That they can leapfrog through the fossil phase and jump straight into the clean energy future in a way. But isn't this also a slightly colonial concept? What do you think? I mean, is working with so many low and middle income countries, do you think that they see it in the same way, or is their entanglement with fossil fuels simply different than ours?
Okay, thank you. This is really stimulating questions. So I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation here. I think we need to, Per was talking about the grand bargain. I sometimes call it a solidarity package, or whatever we want to call it. I just think that we have to recognize that we are on this together globally. Climate is a global problem. And, as we are able to mobilize, countries have shown the capability of extraordinary measures in the pandemic situation to respond to their own needs and tackle this global phenomena of the pandemic with very severe social and economic consequences. We are seeing massive solidarity in the context of the European Union right now with what's happening in Ukraine. Look at this. I think from a political economy point of view and political scientists, I think it would be interesting to hear from the political scientists if they had ever expected this level of response at this speed when it came to this pandemic and to the war in Ukraine. But we seem to be less capable of applying the same judgment and deliberation in action when it comes to climate. And in particular, in terms of going back to the grand bargain, or or whatever we want to call it, vis-a-vis developing countries. We are in this together. So it's important to stop thinking about this from, oh, I'm transferring wealth from a developed country to a developing country. We need to stop, I think, in my view, we need to look at this as is by helping these countries lift themselves out of poverty, make certain investments that we are actually collective going to be able to respond to this crisis, which is going to impact us all. No matter the wealth levels that economies have. There were some interesting cartoons during the pandemic. I don't know if you saw these waves layered on each other, and which basically represented what we are going to be faced with if we pay attention to the scientists. And the latest IPCC report is another call on us to understand what's coming our way. Because the moment the pandemic is, I think of it as a taster of what we can face when the climate impacts really start to hit, because when we cross certain tipping points, there's no going back. It's not like a pandemic that we come up with a vaccine now and we deploy the vaccine and we manage it. Once we've crossed certain thresholds in terms of the climate system, there is no going back. And so this is basically a little bit, and I think this is, it's sort of like difficult, and in the world that we live in right now, that, there is quite a bit of a tendency in many countries to revert back to more nationalist narratives and looking inwards. Protectionism. We need to evolve and understand that we need to be in a different paradigm. A paradigm that, if I'm Portuguese, if my government, Portugal, invests in developing countries, it is investing in Portugal. That if in Norway you are investing in developing countries, you are investing in Norway. Because in the end of the day, climate is going to hit us all. So that is that's my first reflection on this. And if we were to think, like that, I think we would be able. And again, what we just did, what the politicians just did, what the decision makers just did in terms of response to Ukraine war and to the response to Ukraine, it really shows that when there's a will, quite impressive measures can be taken. And we could be commenting here on, what Germany has done in terms of reversal of an historical position, of the increase in their military budget, and an array of other measures that most people probably didn't think were really plausible to happen, and they are happening. Of course, we can have a debate on whether or not there are different views on whether some of those are the right positions, but independently, that's not the point. And I think if we were to be in that paradigm and adopt that paradigm, this issue that you are talking about of the colonial narrative, are we really listening, or do the African countries that are not the large countries, do they really have a voice? Do they really have the agency? Because they have different views in terms of the investments that they think are priority to tackle poverty. The question is, because they are not seeing the level of solidarity and support that is required for them to make different investment decisions, then they have to say, I think, in my view, they have to come out and say, we need to do fossil fuel investments, because this is the way to lift us out of poverty. These are our endowments. This is how we can cater for our problems in terms of energy access and so on. Because it's this, because in my view, it's this political economy paradigm that we live in. I mean, it's well known at COP26, developing countries had been asking for, let's reach $100 billion of climate finance support to developing countries annually. Even from multiple sources, different sources, internationally, we couldn't reach it. And, now what the hope is that that can be reached maybe next year. And certainly, developed countries have said in 2025, we commit to going further. But if we look at these numbers, we are talking about 100 billion from multiple sources. Let's look at the response to the pandemic. Let's look at the response when it comes to the Ukraine. There's a disproportionality. I think we have a really, because we have, and I have said it as well, we humans, because it's studied, it's not me, it's the neuroscientists and others that say we have a really hard time because we are not wired like this. We are wired to think short term. We are not wired historically to think, medium long term. And so it's a lot easier for us to respond to an immediate threat, the pandemic, and Ukraine, and actually respond quite appropriately to the seriousness of the threat than it is to think, okay, this is a threat, the climate change is a threat over 10, 15, 20 years. So that was, in terms of one of the points. Yes, it's so I think I was trying to come to some of what you're saying in terms of agency, and it's going to be interesting to see, Egypt, of course, because it's Africa, and I know that Egypt is focusing quite a lot on implementation, on getting action on the ground, because yes, we have to, the political narrative has to evolve, and there has to be political commitments, and there were important political commitments made in Glasgow, but also a little bit of skepticism around what does this mean? What does this mean? All of these commitments on halting deforestation, all of these commitments on avoiding methane emissions, all of these commitments on coal phase down. What does this actually mean when one starts to translate this into countries? And I don't want to manipulate. So just to come back to Per Faro's point on the World Bank, I don't speak on behalf of the World Bank, so I will give you my opinion, but I'm not here speaking on behalf of the World Bank, because we actually have a separate board. So I think, I think there is an important debate going on in terms of, first of all, of course, the World Bank and the other MDBs have been putting out climate change action plans that are more ambitious than what they had before, and entering into areas where they hadn't necessarily done much in the past. So I think that's important. They are also coming out, World Bank and others, saying when will they be Paris aligned? They've been working on this methodology. They are committing to the Paris alignment at different points in time. But I think there is an important conversation that is happening at the moment, which is how does one further mobilize and maximize their capabilities, like you said. The fact that they have a long track record presence in the countries they engage at the policy level. How do we maximize that experience they have and that track record to help countries push for the policy reforms more speedily than what could be normally the case? How does one maximize their resources and their balance sheets to drive even further private capital investments? We are also part of those those discussions. So they are, I think there's a general recognition that that there can be more ambition, and I think there are important conversations happening in terms of driving that. I think I'm mindful, I'm looking at the watch, so I don't want to manipulate the entire...
Thank you for this. It would be great to perhaps open the discussion to the audience now, if possible. But before we get the microphone ready, Dan, you wanted to have
very quickly. So let me just make something very clear. When I say that a lot of these African countries are not pleased, it's not like they don't want to adopt renewable energy.
Yes.
It's not like they don't want to do the right thing. They recognize this problem to be grave too. And by the way, you're absolutely right. The crisis that is the Ukraine or the pandemic was very immediate in front of us and very visible, which is not always the case with climate change, even though it is getting to be more invisible. So that is the political science aspect of, political reactions often take place when it's immediate and very visible. Like a drought doesn't get the response that a flood or visible disaster gets. But going back to this fact that the African perspective is, don't tell us that there's a blanket ban on fossil fuels. Okay, fossil fuel finance. Give us this transition period. Let Uganda develop its oil. Even when it is fully developed and the millions of barrels, it's still not going to make much of a dent in the global emission levels, but it is of importance to Uganda. Let Senegal or Mozambique develop its natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal, which is good for women's health. They will not be inhaling, the smoke from firewood or charcoal. It's good for deforestation, and they're sitting on trillions of tons of natural gas. Why not allow them? So when the German chancellor goes to Senegal, as he did last week, and says that Germany is going to not only invest in natural gas in Senegal, but also import it because of the Ukraine war, then you're beginning to wonder. So the previous sort of blanket ban on fossil fuels is now being lifted because the West wants an alternative source to natural gas. And here is where some of the ethical challenges, and a lot of leaders will say, what's going on? On the one hand, you're saying no more financing for fossil fuels, but here, when you need it, you're saying, okay, we're willing to do a bit. So tell us, what is it that you want?
Do we have a microphone for? There's.
Okay, I come from Indonesia. I would like to address my question to you because most of our energy comes from coal-operated power plant. Only 11% coming from renewable energy, be it hydropowers, solar, or geothermal. And talking about climate objectives, talking about Paris Agreement or COP26, at the end of the day, you need to invest. You need to invest in greenfield. Now, I got a sense that there's a reluctancy to invest because it is long-term investment. It's not clear when you will get your return, not to mention profit. But is there any other way? How do you overcome that? I just would like to get some sense because we as a country need a lot of investment for that.
From Indonesia, correct? This is a country I lived in as well.
Where have you not lived?
Yes. The question of this is the challenge. Not just Indonesia, but South Africa. Our coal transition program. We are going to be focusing on supporting South Africa, Indonesia, India, and Philippines with the coal transition. And your minister, Sri Mulyani, Ibu Sri Mulyani herself, she was recently at the World Bank, IMF spring meetings. She was in an event that we organized, and she touched on a critical point. first of all, is what I was saying earlier on, which is your coal fleet is a lot younger than the coal fleet in developed countries. So the economic life of a lot of these investments, there's still quite a long way to go in terms of the economic life. So if there is an attempt to decommission those coal-fired power plants, the question is somebody needs to be paid to be able to decommission that earlier than they would otherwise. Then you have coal-fired power plants under construction, and you have promises of contracts, off-taker contracts, to power plants that are still not yet under construction. So those are all potential, and she was, of course, looking at it from liabilities on the state. If there is a breach of these contracts, what does this mean from a financial point of view? So all of those issues need to be looked at. On the renewable energy side, as you mentioned, I mean, Indonesia, for example, has quite big, large geothermal potential that is untapped. And in fact, we have also been supporting geothermal power investments in Indonesia. And depends a little bit on what type of investments we are talking about. For example, on geothermal, it's well known that public capital has to come in and de-risk the upstream drilling phase, because private capital will not invest if the resource isn't proven. And so that's a little bit of what we have been doing. But this is, I think, what myself and Perfaro were talking about. There is a need for public capital to de-risk the private sector investments in countries like Indonesia and others. Even though I agree with him that in many cases, the investors are asking for returns that are not commensurate with the actual risks. They are asking for returns which are on the basis of perceived risks. And we also see quite a bit. I didn't expand much in my intervention, but we do see quite a bit. I mean, we are talking to institutional investors, the large pools of capital, and how do we actually bring them to invest? Because they are sitting on trillions of dollars that are actually not being channeled to emerging markets or low-income countries. And this is what they say, they need public capital to be the first loss, or to be to credit enhance their returns, to cater for some credit losses, some losses that they might not themselves be able to take on. And so again, this is new ways have to be found to use public capital that should come from developed countries to basically cater for these risks and these return expectations, which can be negotiated as well. I mean, a lot can be said about return expectations. To basically bring, the interesting point as well is that we are at a point in time where, because of the regulatory pressures in the EU, for example, and in North America, there's actually investors that are looking for opportunities. And so this is sort of like the push coming from the regulatory side as well. But they aren't finding necessarily the ways to do it. So we have to find there has to be work on the policy front in developing countries as well. But there has to be the public capital to basically take care of the risks that they will not be able to absorb.
Thank you very much. I saw your hands. Do we also have any questions from the audience? What? So just. All right. So perfect.
Okay. So this is the heart of the matter, right? This is really where reality starts to bite. And I think we all know the science, right? And that's has to be our starting point, and it is very scarily clear. And unfortunately, the atmosphere doesn't really care about our political economy challenges and our realistic schedules of implementation and so on. So we need to make this a short-term challenge so that our brains can deal with it, as you said. I think the points that Dan made about the African agency and voice and challenges there, and the ambassador's point on investments is really part of the same thing, which I tried to address in my intro points. There's huge investments needed, and if that is to happen in green, so on energy renewables, but there are other examples, land use, infrastructure, there has to be risk sharing. In some instances, because the money really isn't there for the LDC. In other instances, I would argue most of the emerging economies are in that position, that there isn't a balance sheet to manage the risks of large-scale renewables. But there is actually a real potential to get it done if you have risk sharing and get it done in a way that makes everyone come out better at the end of it. And as I mentioned in the introduction, guarantees seem to be a very interesting solution to that. As Norwegians, we're very hesitant of bragging about things that our Swedish neighbors have done. But if you look at, in this context, there is actually a good example. They have this 15 billion Swedish kroner, so it's about $1.5 billion US dollars guarantee fund, which they've run, very Swedish, very professionally. And just to sum up, they've mobilized about 3 times the guarantee for SDG investments and 70 times their real costs. So 70 times the real costs. So there's huge potential. And the thing is, if countries and private sector actually sit down together and design approaches to share the risks, we can scale up. But you need to have serious conversations. So I mean, I don't think we should have discussions about whether there's a right to invest in fossil fuels or not. I think it's more about having an honest discussion about, okay, you want me, if you're, as you said, the finance minister of Malawi, you want me to drive a renewable energy sector. Well, show me how we're going to do that then. What's that going to cost, and who's going to help me pay? How are we going to rig this with a reasonable degree of burden sharing? And that has to happen across the board, countries, sectors. And it's entirely understandable for a country that don't get a reasonable response to that question to be a bit suspicious, right? But we have to get across that threshold because we are all in this together. And unless there is a real public-private partnership to address these investment needs, we won't succeed. And we're all in the same boat. That's at the heart of it. And the investment gap is massive. So there is a really, really serious discussion to be had on this. And again, this sounds like politics, but it's actually science and economics. It won't happen without these kinds of measures.
Can I just quickly respond to him?
Yeah, and
No, please.
I'm entirely sure when we're finished. Not my question.
So I agree with that. I just want to reiterate that it's not just the Malawis, it's also the Nigerias, it's also the Kenyas. It is not just the smaller countries, but the bigger countries in Africa are up in arms, and they just don't understand how this is going on. And this goes back to your question that we really haven't addressed, is do we need a new structure? What kind of governance structures do we need to put in place to make these conversations more credible, more legible, so that people understand where they're coming from? Is it the bank, which has a lot of convening power? Is it some other agency? Certainly not the COP, because it's not working there. So I think that is the kind of discussions we should be having. Smaller groups of countries and even aid providers, banks, etc., coming in and actually providing that incentive that if you have a viable plan, yeah, I can put some money on the table and let's share the risks. I think something there that needs to be done. But the most important thing is that we can't forget that poverty is still a huge problem in all of these countries. So as much as we want these climate goals to be protected, a lot of people say, I'm not going to live till tomorrow, so why should I care? Help me today.
Yeah, thanks. That's, I mean, it's a massive challenge, and we of course know this also from the advice that the Norwegians are giving developing countries who are developing their oil reserves on how to build sovereign wealth funds, where
That
you
has
might
ended now.
actually have some other priorities on spending your oil and gas income first. Can we get the microphone for the last question here?
And while we
Andreas?
get the microphone, just to say that there's an interesting experiment now. I mean, many of you might have seen at the COP in Glasgow the fact that certain countries came together with South Africa and put out this Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is a political declaration. And we were involved in that and continue to be involved in coming up with an investment plan that can be the first phase of a representation of a delivery of that partnership. And so hopefully that can be can come closer to what we are discussing here, which is you bring a group of countries that are committed to supporting an emerging economy, do something that is actually quite significant and challenging, really challenging, and committing politically to a partnership that will go on for a number of years and until you actually reach the goals. And you try to bring in the private capital and, all of the interested parties to contribute, to play a role. So we'll see, how, I think you probably were talking about international processes as well, but I actually think that countries are very specific and the challenges are very specific, even sometimes within countries, regions, and different sectors. So this experiment that is now happening, and there are conversations maybe potentially of doing the same in other countries like Indonesia and others. It's an experiment that I hope will deliver the results.
Last question.
Yes, hi. I'm Andreas and I work here at NUPI as well. You were speaking a little bit about kind of leapfrogging across the kind of carbon-based economy. In countries such as South Africa and India where coal interests are very entrenched, do you find that affects the allocation of capital differently from other developing nations where it's not as entrenched?
There are very significant, and sometimes, the social issues that I was talking about have political ramifications as well. And this is what we were saying. These are big sources of revenue to the local authorities. It could be important sources of revenue to the national authorities. You have leaders, political leaders, that are elected from a base of people that are actually quite attached to the coal industry. So it's not like the social dimension and the political dimension don't come together. They are quite close in many aspects, and so it's really challenging. But I also think this is why I was saying, and also why I expanded a little bit on these two examples, which we've actually documented. Otherwise, we wouldn't know, because of what I said, that the literature review is quite scarce. But this is why it's important to tackle these really significant political economy challenges. Is important to lead with social justice, with just transition. It's important to instill the confidence in the communities and in these regions that there's actually quite a lot of seriousness and commitment to putting in place the policies and the programs that will deliver in terms of social safety, in terms of skills development, in terms of alternative job opportunities. because then you are speaking to what the communities want, and this is also why I was saying procedural justice, and this is the point of agency. These communities have to be involved in determining what is it that should be done and engage in the decision making and in the implementation, because that's how you get the buy-in, which will then trickle up to the political dimension and support. So to me, this is the way of, and I agree, this was one point in common that myself and Per Faro mentioned. If this is not anchored on social justice, on just transition, I don't think we will meet the climate goals, because people will just oppose it.
Thank you very much. We are unfortunately out of time. So I would really like to thank you for being here today, for the fantastic discussion. Thank you to the audience also for joining us, and to the viewers online for being with us spiritually. Thanks a lot.